Hello everyone and welcome to this new video of Deep in Politics. So after having given you in the previous video the general overview of the US 2020 presidential election, it's finally time to tackle in depth the result of some of the battleground state of this 2020 US presidential election. And the first state that we will be studying together is the beautiful state of Florida. So the goal in studying the result of this battleground state in depth is to know what happened in this state and why each of the candidates was able to win this state. And the goal will be to deduct the consequences and the cause that led each of the candidates to win a given battleground state in order to be able to predict the result in this state, whether it's in the 2022 midterm election or in the next presidential election in 2024. So as I said, we will begin by studying the result of the beautiful state of Florida. So Florida is one of the biggest states of the US, and when I say one of the biggest state, I mean one of the biggest state by its population. Florida is a very populated state. It has around 21.5 million people living in it. The fact that it has a big population entitled it to have a big number of electoral votes. Indeed, Florida has 29 electoral votes, which is a big number. It's one of the states that has the biggest number of electoral votes, and it's gonna win. It's gonna be allocated one more electoral vote in the 2024 election. So in 2024, the state of Florida will have 30 electoral votes instead of 29. Florida is one of the most important battleground in the US and one of the most close battleground in the US. So none of the parties, whereas it's the Republican or the Democrat, are being able to control the states. It's always flipping between Republican and Democrats. However, President Trump was able to do good in the state in both elections in 2016 as well as in 2020, and he was even able to improve in 2020 compared to 2016. Let's take a look to the result of the 2016 as well of the 2020 election in Florida. So this is the 2016 result. As you can see, President Trump was able to win the state of Florida over Hillary Clinton by a margin of 1.2%, whereas he was able to win the state of Florida in 2020 by around 3.3%. And as you see, he has improved his score in comparison to 2016. So let's compare these results. This is what you will see. Let's compare the result of the general election in Florida. So in 2016, President Trump was able to win the state by 48.6% to 47.4% for Hillary Clinton, whereas he was able to win the state in 2020 by 51.2% to 47.9% for President Biden. So as you see, the Republican and President Trump gained around 3.6% in comparison to 2016, whereas the Democrat only gained 0.5% compared to 2016. This allowed President Trump and the Republican to extend their lead over Democrat compared to 2016 by around 2.1%. As I said, they ended up winning the state by 3.3%. Now, like everywhere else in the US, the state of Florida saw a big number of voter turnout in the 2020 election compared to 2016. And I said it in the previous video that the 2020 election was an election with a high voter turnout. And the reason is that this election was highly anticipated. It was between two very opposite candidates, and the US was divided between them. Secondly, and most importantly, the vote by email was used in a big way, which allowed a lot of persons who usually don't vote to vote because it was simple to do so. And so we will see, and so the total number of voters increased in Florida by 20.2%. So we had 20.2% more voters in 2020 than in 2016. And here you can see the numbers. The total number of votes for the Republican went up from 4.6 million to 5.6 million. They gained around 1 million more voters, whereas the Democrat went from 4.5 million to 5.3 million. they also gained around 800,000 voters. This is an increase of 22.7% for the Republican and an increase of 17.5% for the Democrat. So these are the general number of the election. Now we will get a little bit more in details, a little bit more into the result of some decisive counties of Florida. But before this, just let me talk a little bit about the ethnic diversity of Florida. So before continuing and talking about the ethnic diversity, just let me tell you that I take all my data from the Census Reporter website. It's a very good website. You can find all the information of the states and even of the counties of a given states in this website. You just have to type here what you want to see. For example, now we are talking about Florida, but you can also put New York, you can put any state, and even you can see in details the result and the information of each of the counties in a given state. So here just to give you a look, for example, this is the median age, this is the race and ethnicity. You also find the income, the average income, and what also is important for us is the percentage of bachelor degree, as well as the geographical mobility and the migration. But for now, let's talk about the ethnic diversity. So Florida is a very diversified state when it comes to race and ethnicity. As you see, it's composed of 53% of white population, 26% of Hispanic population, and 15% of black population. So as you see, the minority population is very important and abundant in the state of Florida. You have more than 30% of the voters that are Hispanic or black voters, and this is very important, especially for Democrat, because as I said in the previous video, white voters or white population tends to vote more for Republican than they do for Democrat, whereas Democrat usually do way better among the minorities, among the Hispanic as well as black voters. And what used to happen in the election of Florida in the past decades is that the white population, the white voters, were voting in big numbers for the Republican, whereas the minorities that is formed of Hispanic and black voters were voting more in big numbers, and were giving a huge advantage for the Democrat. But what happened in this election was a little bit the opposite of what used to happen, because as we will see, the Republican did extremely well among Hispanic voters, and this was the main reason of them winning the election. They also did better than expected among black voters, and the Democrat this time surged among white voters, and especially among white educated voters. They didn't do well among all categories of voters, but they did very well, extremely well, and better than they did in the previous election among white educated voters. So just a small information here, a small remark. When I'm saying educated voters, I mean the voters that have a bachelor degree or more, that have at least a bachelor degree. It doesn't mean that they understand politics better, that they are right and the others are wrong. No, it just means that they have a bachelor degree. This is the only thing that I mean when I'm talking about educated voters. And the state of Florida has a good portion of people having a bachelor degree, have a good portion of educated people. Here you see you have around 30.7% of adult people having at least a bachelor degree, which is a good percentage compared to the US. It's around the same percentage as the US. The average of the people having a bachelor degree in the US is 33.1%, whereas in Florida it's around 31%. And this favored the Democrat, because the Democrat did very, very well in this election among the category of educated voters, and especially educated white voters. But in Florida it wasn't enough for them to win the election or even to do better than 2016, because as we said, the Republican did extremely well among Hispanic voters. So now let's move more into details of what happened in the state of Florida. So this is how we will proceed, not only in studying the state of Florida, but in our study of any of the battleground state of the US. So I divided the counties that form the state of Florida and any other state into two categories. The first category is the category of small counties, whereas the second one is the category of medium-sized and big counties. Why did I proceed in this way? Well, for one reason, because as a general rule, a small county tend to vote more for Republican than Democrat, whereas medium-sized and big counties tend to vote more for the Democrat. Why is this? Well, because small counties are more conservative, people know themselves more than in big counties, and generally they are from one ethnic group, there isn't a lot of diversity, and so they are very conservative, and the Republican Party is a conservative party. Whereas in big and medium-sized county there are more ethnic diversity, people tend to go more to school and to learn about learn about liberal ideas, and so they tend to vote more for the Democrat, which is a liberal party, at least more liberal than the Republican. So let's talk a little bit now about the small counties. So as usual, as everywhere else in the US, the Republican did extremely well in these small counties. These small counties generally contain a big majority of white people, and these people generally don't go to college, they don't have a bachelor degree, they do not face liberal ideas, so they are very conservative. And this was the stronghold of the Republican, not only in the state of Florida, but everywhere else in the US. So these category of white non-educated voters are very important for the Republican. They are their stronghold, and the Republican need to take care of them. They need to listen to their voice, because they will be their stronghold in any upcoming election. And this is what President Trump relied on in winning the 2016 election and in doing great in the 2020 election. So as I said, the Republican did very well in the small counties. They improved in around 35 small county out of 40, so they did very, very well. And their biggest improvement came in counties where there is important share of Hispanic voters. So as expected, they did well among rural white voters, but what was unexpected is that they did very, very well among Hispanic voters, not only in rural country, but in all the counties, as we will see. So let's take some example of these rural county that voted big or that voted in big number for the Republican. So the first small county rural county that I will talk about and that I chose to show you the result is the small county of Glades. Glades is a small county located in Florida. It has a small population of around 13.5 thousand citizens, and it's a county where you have an important share of minority voters. You have 60% of white voters, 20% of Hispanic, and 13% of black population. So the minority voter form around 35% of the total population, and the Hispanic alone form around 1/5 or even 1/4 of the total population, around 25%. And in 2016, the Republican were able to win this county 68.5% to around 29%. And in 2020, they were able to do even better than in 2020, as they were able to win the state by 73% to 26.7%. And this is an improvement, as you will see here. So I drew tables in order to make it easier for us to understand the shift and to compare the 2016 to the 2020 results. So as you see, the Republican, they got in 2016 68.5%, whereas in 2020 they improved to 72.8%, and this is a gain of 4.4%. Whereas the Democrat, compared to 2016, lost around 2.3%. They only got 26.7%, whereas in 2016 they got 29%, and this enabled the Republican to extend their lead by around 6.7%, which is a big number. It's a very good improvement for the Republican. And the fact that this country has a big number of minority voters, especially Hispanic voters, show you once again that the Republicans were able to surge among Hispanic voters, and you will see this more than once while watching this video and while studying the state of Florida. A second county that I want you to see, and it has a lot of similarity with Glades County, is the county of Hendry. It's located just near the county of Glades. So Hendry County is bigger than Glade County. It has a population of around 41,000 U.S. citizens. It's also a very diversified country, and most importantly, it's a county where Hispanic voters and Hispanic population represent the majority of the population. Look, it represents more than 50%, 54% to be more precise, and white voters only represent 32% of the total number of population or voters. And in this county, well, the Republicans were able to win it in 2016, but not by a big margin. They won it 55% to 41%. While in 2020 they did a lot better than 2016, as they were able to win it 61% to 30.1%. Once again, let's compare the result with our tables. So this is the result of the county of Hendry County. So as you see, the Republican won it in 2016 by around 13%, 55.4 to 41.3. And look here, in 2020 they were able to win it by a lot more, 61 to 38. And this is an improvement for Republican. They improved their score by 4.7%. Compared to 2016, they went up from 55.4 to 61.1, whereas the Democrat lost. They went down from 41.3% to 38.1%, and this enabled the Republican to extend their lead in this county by around 9%, which is a big number. 8.9%, an improvement of 8.9% is a big number. And what was the main reason of this improvement? Well, of course, since this county contained a big number of Hispanic voters, and since we already know and knew that the white voters were gonna vote for Republican in big numbers, so the only possible explanation is that the Republican did very well among Hispanic voters. A big number of Hispanic voters who used to vote for the Democrat voted this time for. So now let's move to the Democrat and see how they did in the small counties. Well, they did terribly bad. It's expected that they don't do well, as small counties, as I said, contain generally a big number of white rural voters who are very conservative and who tend to vote for the Republican. However, in the state of Florida, the Democrat did even worse than anywhere else in the U.S. in the small counties. As they were able to improve in only two of these county. The small county where Democrats were able to improve were county where you have an important portion of white educated voters, which make you see that the Democrats were able to improve among this category of white voters, and only among the category of educated white voters, as in the category of rural voters, the Republican did much better, and even better than 2016. So the county that will give you an idea about how Democrat did in small in the small county and in the small county that they were able to improve in is the county of Walton. Walton County is a county of around 74,000 U.S. citizens. It's a county with a big portion of white voters. White voters represent the big majority of the total population and voters in this county. It's also a county that has a good share of a good average of bachelor degree among its adult population, around 30%. It's around the average of Florida, and it's a big average for a small county, because small county usually have a much smaller percentage of bachelor degree than the average and the big one. And let's see a little bit the result. Let's try to compare the result in 2016 and in 2020. So in 2016, President Trump was able to win this county 76 to 20% by around 56% margin, whereas in 2020 he was able to win the state by less than 50%. And let's compare the result. I also drew a table here in order to make it easier for you to see the difference between the two elections. So as I said, President Trump was able to win the county, of course, in both elections. However, in 2016 he won it by a larger margin, 76 to 20.3%, whereas in 2020 he only won it 75.4% to 23.7%. So if we compare both results, we see that the Republican lost around 0.6% in comparison to 2016, whereas the Democrats were able to win 3.4% in the total votes. So this account to a shift from Republican to Democrat by 4%. So the Democrat closed the gap from Republicans. They closed the gap between them and the Republican by 4% compared to the 2016 election. And as I said, the reason is that white voters, educated white voters, shifted from Republican to Democrat in not only the state of Florida but everywhere else in the US. So now that we saw the small counties and how the election shaped there, let's move to medium-sized and big counties. Well, as everywhere else in the US, the Democrat did better among this category of counties. And the reason, as I said previously, is that in these counties there is more ethnic diversity. People tend to interact with each other more, and so they are more open-minded. Also, you have more college in these counties, and when you go to college, generally you are more in touch with liberal idea, and so you vote more toward the left, toward the Democrat. The main reason that the Democrats were able to improve big in these counties is their surge among white educated voters. Indeed, it seems that white educated voters didn't like President Trump's policy, maybe because he was a far-right candidate, a far-right president, and generally educated voters, when they go to college and interact with others more than non-educated voters, well, they don't really like a far right or far left politic, but they prefer a centrist politic, and President Biden was way more to the center than President Trump was, and so the main reason for Democrat improving big in this county is their surge among white educated voters. But despite this surge, the Democrats weren't able to win the state of Florida because they lost very big among Hispanic voters. The key of the 2020 election in Florida was Hispanic voters, was the shift of Hispanic voters from Democrat to Republican, as we will see. But let's begin by showing you how good Democrat did among white educated voters. To show you this, I chose two counties that we will be studying together, two big counties where Democrat improved. First is St. Joan County. St. John's County is a big county. It has a population of around 1/4 million, even more than 1/4 million voters. It's a county where there is a big majority of white population, around 83%. And most importantly, it is a county where you have a big percentage of people having a bachelor degree. Look, it's around 50%, and it's a big number, because the average in Florida is only 13.7%. So here it's much higher than the average. So most of the voters in St. John County are white educated voters. And now let's compare the result between 2016 and 2020 in St. John's County. In 2016, President Trump was able to win the election 64.3% to 31.3%, and it's normal because even educated white voters tend to vote for Republican more than they do for Democrat. White voters in general, no matter what is their class and their education, vote more for the Republican than Democrat. So in 2016, President Trump was able to win the county by around 33%. Whereas in 2020, he was of course, he won the county, he kept it, but he won it by only but he won it only 63% to 36.2%. And now let's compare the result of these two elections, and as usual we'll go to our table. So we see that compared to 2020, the Republican lost 1.5%. They went down from 64.3 to 62.8, and this is a loss of 1.5%, whereas the Democrats were able to improve their score by around 5%. They went up from 31.3% to 36.2%, and this allowed them to close the gap between them and the Republican by 6.4%. So there was a shift in this country by 6.4% in favor of the Democrat, and this is a big shift. And now if we know that this county is a county that contains a big majority of white people, of white voters, around 83%, and that these white voters are educated, or at least half of them have a bachelor degree, so we can say that the reason that Democrats were able to surge in this country is their surge among white educated voters. And the same happened in Duval. Duval is also a big county that is located just at the frontiers of St. John's County. Let's see what happened in Duval also in 20. So Duval County is a county where there is a big portion, or a big percentage of black voters, of a black population. They form around 30% of the total voter share. There is also a majority of white voters. Hispanic don't really have a big share of the total population. So it's also a county where you have a good percentage of bachelor degree among the adult people, around 30.6%. It's around the average of Florida. And the Democrats were able to improve in this state. So this is Duval County. President Trump was able to barely win it in 2016, 40.5% to 47.1%. The Democrats were able to flip this county in 2020, as they were able to win it 51.3% to 47.4%. Let's go to our table in order to compare these results. So this is Duval County. As you see, Republican lost 1.1% of the total vote compared to 2016, whereas the Democrats were able to win or to gain around 4.2%, sorry, and this allowed them to flip the county, as there was a shift of 5.3% in their favor. And the main reason for this is their surge among black voters. Of course, black voters in all cases they tend to vote Democrat more than Republican. But what made them, if you want, to win this extra point that allowed them to flip the country is their surge among white educated voters. So what happened in Duval and St. John, you can find it happening everywhere else in Florida, in counties where you have a big percentage of white educated voters as well as black voters, and this shows once again the surge of Democrat among white educated voters. I only chose 2 counties here and a few counties in the small counties, because what we saw here, you're gonna saw it in each counties that resemble the counties that we studied. Now let's move to Republican and see how they did in big counties. So as I said, they did not as good as Democrat, because big counties tend to vote for the Democrat for the reason that I previously said. However, they did better than other states in big counties, and the reason is that they were able to gain a lot of ground among Hispanic voters, and this was the main reason of them winning the state and improving their score. So the two states, the 2 counties that I chose in order to show you the big surge of Republican among Hispanic voters are the counties of Osceola and of course Miami-Dade, which is the biggest county of Florida. So let's begin first by studying the state of Osceola. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing it correctly, but as you know, I'm not from Florida and not from the US. So Osceola is a very big county of Florida. It has a little bit less than 400,000 total population. Hispanics voters form the majority of the voters in this county. They form around 56%, whereas white people or the white population only constitute 30% of the total population. So let's compare the result of this county in both the 2016 and the 2020 election. So as you see in 2016, Hillary Clinton and the Democrat were able to win the county by around 25% margin, 60.4% to 35.6%, whereas in 2020 also Biden was able to keep the country with him, but he won it by a much smaller margin, 56% to 42%. Let's compare the election, the result with our table. So here we are in Osceola. The Republican gained 7% between 2016 and 2020. They went up from 35.6% to 42.6%. It's a big improvement, whereas the Democrat lost big in this election. They went down from 60.4% to 56.5%. It's a loss of 4%. It's a big shift in this country. It's a shift of 11% in favor of not Democrat, in favor of the Republican. The Republican overall improved their score and closed the gap between them and the Democrat by 11%. It's a big shift in favor of the Republican, and of course the main reason is their surge among Hispanic voters, as Hispanic voters form the majority of this state, of this county. So this shows how good the Republican did among Hispanic voters, and the same thing happened, and even in a more important way in the big county of Miami-Dade. Miami-Dade is the biggest county of Florida. And here too, the Republicans were able to improve big, and the main reason is their surge among Hispanic voters. So let's go to Miami-Dade and see what happened there. Where is Miami-Dade? This is Miami-Dade. Let's see what happened in this county. But as I told you, we will see once again the Republicans surging among Hispanic voters. So this is Miami-Dade. Miami-Dade have a population of 2.7 million U.S. citizens. It's a very big population. The big majority of the population is Hispanic voters. Hispanic voters form more. Hispanic voters and the Hispanic population form more than 2/3 of the total population of the county of Miami-Dade. And let's compare the election and see how big was the shift among Hispanic voters from Democrat to Republican. Here you see Hillary Clinton winning the election by around 30%, 63 to 33%, and whereas in 2020 President Biden was able to keep the country. But look, the margin went down by a lot. He only won it by 7%, whereas Hillary Clinton won it by around 30%. So you have a shift of more than 23%. And let's compare these results more clearly in this table. So in 2016, the Republican only got 33.8% of the total vote in Miami-Dade, whereas in 2020 they got more than 46%, and this is a huge gain for them. They gained 12.3% in comparison to 2016. A huge gain for and improvement for Republican. Whereas the Democrat lost big in the county of Miami-Dade. They went down from 33% to 53%. It's a loss of around 10 points. And so in the county of Miami-Dade, there was a huge shift in favor of Republican, a shift of 22.1%, maybe one of the biggest shifts in any county of the U.S. I don't think that there is a county in the U.S. where there was such a big shift, 22.1% in favor of the Republican. And of course, the reason is clear. It's the shift among Hispanic voters, as the Hispanic voter form the big majority of the voters in Miami-Dade. So the Republican was able to do very, very well among the Hispanic voters. And if it wasn't from this, from their improvement among Hispanic voters, the election would have been way, way more close in the state of Florida. And I personally think that they would have lost the election, because the Democrat, as we saw, improved very good among white educated voters, and if they were able to keep their advantage, their big advantage among Hispanic voters, they would have won the state for sure. So if I want to take the consequences and the important remark from the state of Florida, what I can say is the following. For the Democrat, their positive point is their surge among white educated voters. Their negative point, of course, is their big regression among Hispanic voters. And if they don't find a way to gain back at least part of this base, they will not win the state of Florida anymore. It's impossible for them to win the state of Florida without going back and winning some of the Hispanic voters that they lost. As for Republicans, their biggest positive point in the state of Florida is, of course, their big surge among Hispanic voters. And if they find a way to keep this surge, to keep this improvement among Hispanic voters, I'm sure that they will win each and every election in Florida from now on. Their second positive point is that they made sure that they have a huge advantage and a huge base among white non-educated and white rural voters. These voters are very important for the Republican, not only in the state of Florida, but everywhere else in the US. The main reason or the main cause that will let the Republican win any election is for them to keep this base motivated and to hear the voice of this base. Without these rural white voters, it's impossible for Republican to win any election, and from now on they will have to hear them. I mean, this category of voters, the white rural voters, was neglected by the Republican before 2016. President Trump was able to come to motivate them and to let them vote again in a huge number for Republican, and he made them the stronghold of the Republican, and the Republican need to hear this base very good, because without them they will not be able to win any election, not only in the state of Florida. But still, the biggest improvement for Republican is their surge among Hispanic voters, because no one was expecting the eve of the election this big surge. I mean, we might have expected a small amelioration compared to 2016, but not in the numbers that we've seen. So to conclude, let me say that the state of Florida, who has been a battleground state for many decades now, a very close battleground state, is beginning to shift toward the Republican. And I do think that if the election if the 2020 election was held in other circumstances, if it wasn't from the COVID-19 pandemic, if it wasn't from some event that happened before this election, the Republican and President Trump would have won this state by more than 5%. And I do think that this state of Florida, who has been a battleground state, has been shifting now since 2 elections in favor of the Republican, and I can say that from now I will not consider it a very tight battleground state, but a lean Republican state. Of course, the Democrat can still win it, but the Republican will have the edge, they will have the advantage, and the reason is that, of course, their surge among Hispanic voters and the fact that in any next election they will be able to gain back some of the white voters, some of the white educated voters that they've lost in this election. Because I think that any next candidate of the Republican will be more centrist, more to the center than President Trump. So I think that in the 2022 midterm election, as well as in the 2024 presidential election, the Republican will be able to win the state of Florida by more than 3 and 4%, of course, provided that they are able to preserve and to protect their surge among Hispanic voters. So thanks for listening to this video. I hope you liked it and that it was informative, and I will see you soon in our analysis of the next battleground state.